So, Chimachukma, Saho Chafa Jonil Henderson, Chata Siya Hoke. And in Choctaw, I've said hello to everyone and hope you're doing well. And I'm Neil Henderson in Oklahoma, Choctaw. And I also want to just express my appreciation for the previous two presentations by Dr. Jolie Trotter and Dr. Jordan Lewis. Very helpful. And thanks, Dr. Minocha, too, for your organization of this, the whole conference and the other conferences. And I think the University of North Dakota WEP is really a force for good, and I appreciate being a part of that. And so I want to first address, and I'm going to go kind of rapidly here because there's a lot that I'd like to share with you, and it's being recorded. So if details are wanted by at a later time, they'll be available for that. I want to just address the title of this. And in this usage, embodiment refers to the process by which non-biological matters like social and cultural situations and experiences become biologized. They can become actual pathology through a stress model kind of explanation for it. So persistent toxic stress produces an endocrine response that is potentially damaging to metabolic systems, to brain function even, and blood vessel damage, and the list goes on. And that's how stresses from non-biological matters can convert to increased morbidities and ultimately increased mortalities. The oppression part has to do with, I think, what we all know about the actual history that has occurred over the last few hundred years with indigenous people of this continent and elsewhere. And so that oppression is the toxic stress. The next line with the biocultural term is that I will be looking at dementia with you from a partly biological and a partly sociocultural perspective and integrate these two as we go through the talk. And the last line of the title, dementia, includes dementia causation and the hugely multifactorial contributors to brain dysfunction of a kind that is degenerative and progressive, and the kinds that we're talking about in late life here. But the end of it is maybe a little bit of a new part, which we've heard partly in Dr. Jolie Trotter's talk and Dr. Lewis's talk on risk reduction. And then all of this I want to drive toward specificity for Indian country. Next slide. So this is a picture that I think we've all seen many times, and we understand that brain cell loss is going on, and that's going to affect a person's behavior. Next. Another way of looking at what's going on inside the brain is with PET scans. And so here, what we're looking at is the activity between neurons, and you want as little bit of dark purple as you can get. So you see in the right image, there's more purple. And next, severe loss of connections between neurons in the brain. And so correspondingly, the person's behavior and function would be definitely impaired. Next. Now, this is right off the Alzheimer's Association website. And there was a time a few years back in which the nosology for referring to dementia was sharpened up a bit. And here's one of the outcomes for it. So it's an umbrella term. And then you see the different kinds of dementias. That's not all of them, of course. But what this doesn't show actually is that in one person, you often have a mix of Alzheimer's vascular and typically some Lewy body effects. And that's not reflected here. So just FYI, it's very typical to have actual mixtures. Next. Continuing with the terms, just broadly, it's an organic brain condition. And you see more percentages attached to each one of these. And in this one, the third one down, you see mixed at 50%. And then the DLB is dementia with Lewy bodies, frontotemporal, and on down the line there. I would suggest that these numbers out here beside the identified types of dementia, just think of them as broad kind of reference points about more or less as opposed to an exact number. And the next slide will show us that, why we need to think of it broadly. Next slide. This is a neurologist, Vladimir Hachinsky, who for his entire career has been looking at causes of dementia other than beta amyloids and the tau proteins. And so what he has here in the pie chart is with people who had a diagnosis of dementia. In the gray portion of the pie, primary Alzheimer's pathology. This is at autopsy, about 25%. Below that, vascular pathology as primary, about 25%. And then the purple over at the left, mixed vascular with Alzheimer's, about 25%. And then in the blue moving up there above 9 o'clock is primary Lewy body pathology. But what I really want to show you is this part up here that is in the gray, where 11.97%, even though in clinical diagnosis was dementia, there was no corresponding pathology in the brain that would be supporting the behavior and cognitive impairment of that person. So these are some of the little clues that tell us that we have a long ways to go to really fully understand this condition. And because there are many kinds of dementia, as we've seen on this list, there is a kind that is a prion disease, and it was to give you an idea of how far back research on these conditions go. This is from the 1950s in New Guinea, and it's a disease called Kuru. And so, next slide. It was a fatal disease. Kuru means to shiver or tremble in the 4A language of the New Guinea population. And it affected mainly adult women, as you see in this picture, and next, children. And so on the right is a epidemiologist, geneticist named Carlton Gadjicek. He figured out what was going on because he asked the question, why is it mainly women and children? And it had to do with mortuary practices. And the women were responsible for dealing with the bodies of the deceased, which included some removal of the brain where most of the virus was collected and concentrated. And as they handled that material, they would sometimes touch it to their mouth, which technically could be called a type of cannibalism, and in so doing infected themselves. Now, it wasn't known, a prion wasn't known at that time, so he called it an unconventional virus because it could be acquired and have a latency period as long as 30 to 50 years before it was reactivated into a fatal condition. So there are some of these matters that go on in rare cases today. Next. So what's causing this? We all, I think, have heard of the beta amyloids and the taus, and the term neurotoxic here just means that there would have been conditions that produced excessive beta amyloid and tau, and that those in turn interfere with normal functioning of a neuron, and they ultimately will die. And then infection is, we don't often think of it this way, but there can be infection from the gums, that is the gingiva, the mouth. There can be infections from, you've heard of leaky gut syndrome perhaps, and the one cranial nerve that goes through the torso of the body is called the vagus nerve, vagus meaning wandering in this case. And it provides, some think, a pathway back up to the brain, from the torso back up to the brain, and produces an immune response, inflammation, and chronic inflammation is something that also impairs cell functions. Metabolic dysfunctions here, I think I would redo this slide next time around and call it cardiometabolic dysfunctions. And that's where we find the hypertensions, the obesities, the diabetes type 2, and so forth. And then I think we've all heard of the ApoE and the E4 allele, the last one on the slide there, that increases the risk for developing Alzheimer's. If you've got 2 copies of it, one from each parent, 8 to 12 times greater risk for Alzheimer's. And if you just have 1 copy, it's less, but still an increased risk. If you had E3 and or E2, then that's not so much of a problem. But that's the one that we know of that is pretty much going to be present in any population. But we're going to find out something new about the E4 allele later here in the presentation that has to do with American Indian Alaska Native populations. Next. So is this a real problem for Indian country? Yes, this 1990 to 2050 in this slide. And so we would see an aging population would have a corresponding increase in the amount of cases of some kind of cognitive impairment. So it is something that we're dealing with now and we'll deal with more in the future. Next. This is an interesting slide that is sometimes a little bit troublesome and shocking to people, and yet has a good side to it as well, I think. And what we're looking at here along the horizontal line at the top is a person's age from birth to 80 and over. The other color lines below it are brain changes that are occurring that will be associated with becoming symptomatic of some kind of dementia. And the kind of shocking thing about this is that these changes can be picked up in a person's 30s and 40s and 50s. So the process of the brain pathology going on is something that is a long and slow process, not detectable at age 30, 40, and 50 without some pretty sophisticated PET scans and some cerebrospinal fluid checking and those kinds of looking for biomarkers. And what I think is possibly good about this is that 30 or so years before symptoms is the time window when prevention and risk reduction can occur. And so if we know that there's something subclinical going on there, or the possibility of that happening, then that's when we would most strongly apply our lifestyle approaches. And not that we would end them in late life, we would continue them. But it's real different than what we do now, which is mainly wait until people become symptomatic and then try to find some magic bullet to fix it. And we see those new drugs, monoclonal antibody drugs coming up. And after symptoms are underway and obvious, it's really hard to work backwards. Next. So here's a chart review from Caso Permanente in Northern California, and it shows American Indian Alaska Natives as having the second position for incidence of dementia between the years 2000 and 2013. And another thing about this broadly is that we see that the dementias are not evenly distributed across population segments. Some have more, some have less. And in this case, we are in position number 2. Next. In this slide, the dark bar is males, the gray is females, and across the bottom, over to the far right, are American Indian and Alaska Native. And what it shows us here is a general pattern across all these population segments that, yes, there are differences, and yet there is a similar pattern with regard to gender and prevalence. Next. These are age groupings now, and out to the far right, American Indian Alaska Native, age 85 and older. And the older the person gets in each one of these groupings, the older the person gets, the more likely that there will be some kind of dementia. So that's another factor that seems to be operating across all of these groups. And I will say, as Dr. Jolie Trotter mentioned earlier about misclassification, I would again think of these numbers not so specifically correct, but rather a broad picture. Next. Now, this is a study from Canada, and the blue line that you see there is a non-native population, and the black line is a nearby or mixed in population of First Nations people. And one of the things to the left where you see the bullets is that the finding here was a prevalence of 34% higher in the First Nations people compared to the nearby non-natives. Earlier onset by a decade, and in this case, more males in this sample than females, and then a rate of increase faster operating in this particular sample as well. This is Dr. Kristen Jacqueline that was mentioned by Dr. Lewis a few minutes ago. Next. A little bit of a history of when did research on the Alzheimer's and dementias begin in Native people. And this is a publication in 1993, as you see from Canada there. It compared a remote living Cree population with non-native people in Winnipeg, Canada. Next. These are the findings in the next slide. And Hugh Hendry, neurologist, had the first two bullets here were the most significant. AD prevalence very low compared to that of the people in non-native people in Winnipeg. It's a very early study. There's nothing random about it or anything like that, but it opened the door, and the publication date is 1993. Next. After this, Cherokee Nation, Oklahoma, Roger Rosenberg, another neurologist, had a clinic there. And next slide. The findings were these. Looking at the third bullet, 26 cases compared to 26 control. And then the next bullet is important. He found that the caseness risk for showing signs of dementia was inversely related to the degree of Cherokee ancestry, which means the genetic load. The people that had the most genetic load of indigenous Cherokee genes had the least risk for Alzheimer's disease. And that is kind of good news. And the last bullet is where we begin to pick up some signals that we're accumulating now about the effect of ApoE4. When that's present, as we saw in the earlier slide, in, we'll just use the broad term of the white population, it is going to increase the risk for developing dementia. But when it was present here, it was low frequency in presence, and yet still did not have the same way of operating to promote conversion to full Alzheimer's disease. Next slide. And this is work I did back home in Choctaw Nation of Oklahoma. And the next slide is the findings. We were looking for the frequency of the E4 allele. But here's what we did differently. The low bar, the low yellow bar, is the frequency of the E4 allele in those tribal members that had the highest load, genetic load of indigenous genes. And then as you added more European genes into it, we understand genetic admixture is exceedingly common, if not universal. It begins to increase the frequency of the E4. And the last tall column was a comparison of that to the white population. But importantly, we also found that when E4 was present, it did not have the same capability of converting to Alzheimer's as it did in the white population. Next slide. This is just recently, 2022, Dr. Suki Dicey from Washington used strong heart data to put this together, 811 sample size. 22% were E4 carriers. Now compare that back to what I just showed you, 6%, but I stratified for genetic admixture. This did not stratify for genetic admixture, which is why I think that stratification is an important matter to consider. But what this study also found was that the E4 did not promote Alzheimer's, did not promote convert from normal to Alzheimer's just because there was 1 or 2 copies of E4. So we're beginning to get signals that are, I think, too significant to ignore for research. If E4 doesn't operate to promote dementia and Alzheimer's in native people, why? And there are some ideas about some mutations, genetic mutations that go on. There's also a study by Trumbull in which he did this in the northern part of South America with indigenous people. And people that had the E4 allele were not affected by the E4 allele negatively unless they also had a hookworm infection. Those people that had a hookworm infection were not affected by E4. Now, let me be sure I said that correct. Those that did not have a hookworm infection, did not have it, did have the negative effect of E4. Those that had it were able to have some brain protection from that in the presence of this infection. And nobody fully understands. It's probably an immune response that is taking place. So the E4 business is something that is really interesting and not well understood, but for what we know for North American indigenous people, we need to look into that a lot more. Next. This is out of the Orthodox Journal, Alzheimer's and Dementia. And again, it's Hachinsky, and he's calling for, or observing really, and calling for a paradigm shift. What he's talking about here is let's look at dementias not only as these proteins in the brain that are causing such trouble, but that's also factor in a lot of other kinds of possible causations or contributors to that. Next slide. This is where we get into identifying conditions and lifestyle factors that can operate for risk reduction. Now, at the top of the slide, you see the new 6th goal, the National Alzheimer's Project Act, NAPA, out of the Obama administration, had 5 goals originally. Just recently, a new one was added, which emphasizes, as you see here, risk reduction. And this is because waiting until the symptoms happen and then trying to fix it with a pill is not working. So then what happens? What do? You try to go for prevention and risk reduction. And these are all of the associated comorbidities. And you see the cardiometabolic conditions throughout here, diabetes, hypertension, inactivity, diet, obesity. All the others are important too. But that part with the diabetes is particularly relevant to Indian country, as we know. Next slide. This also is out of Alzheimer's and Dementia, and I mentioned that journal name just simply because I think that's a widely read one and produces a lot of good things. And it's fairly orthodox, I think, in its orientation. And so for the first time in 2019, I saw this web of causation approach. That is a multifactorial, heterogeneous causation map that includes things besides just aging and genetics and the neuropathies, the A betas and P taus in there, to environmental factors, oral health, gut microbiome, there's the leaky gut business and the vagus nerve, diet, exercise, and so forth, as officially recognized as really important to deal with. It's not that this was the newest thought ever on the planet, but to have it given the level of importance that we see there was striking. Okay, next. This is another view of a multifactorial finding that comes from England, and this is the Gil Livingston and the group. And the bottom line to this is that they consider these little color bubbles following the curvy line. If you eliminate all those, you would prevent 40% of dementia. 40% of dementia, maybe we could say, doesn't have to happen. And through this, you see all the cardiometabolic conditions, plus other things that are very important too, education level, sleep, traumatic brain injury. All of that's a part of what you see on this slide too. And that's in the journal Lancet, if you would want to look at it. And 2020, Gil Livingston. Next. Now, when we're talking about these multifactorial conditions and comorbidities, then we look for dementia and type 2 diabetes, and then stratify that number across population segments. And notice that American Indian, Alaska Native people move up to first place now. We were second, but then you select for diabetes and dementia, and we're in number one position. And so why would that happen? Why would this condition be doing that? And many multitude of factors, but one of them is that the hyperglycemic or high sugar level in the blood persistently will damage the interior walls of blood vessels. And so we think of kidneys and we think of extremities and amputations and things like that, but guess what? Those blood vessels are in the brain as well. And dysfunction at the capillary level in the brain, in which all kinds of nutrients and O2 and sugars need to get out and waste products back in to be sent out and so forth. We need those capillaries in the brain to work as normally as possible. And persistent hyperglycemia will interfere with that, and correspondingly, we have more cases. So where's this type 2 diabetes coming from? Next slide. You remember the slide at the early part of this talk where there was a coronal slice of the brain comparing normal and one that had Alzheimer's pathology? We have that picture because that person died. We are looking in that picture at the end of Alzheimer's disease. I'm suggesting we are looking at one of the biggest beginnings of Alzheimer's disease right there. Next slide. That's what it looks like when you take it home. That's the standard American diet called the SAD diet. Highly processed foods, high sugar foods. And now everybody can have a party now and then, of course. But look at this and think in terms of the issues of every day, 7 days a week, month after month after month, year after year after year. I think we can agree that that is going to have some kind of bodily effect, and correspondingly, the entire U.S. and much of the globe has an obesity problem, an overweight problem, and a diabetes problem, and that will connect to increased risk for dementia. So do we have to eat like that? No, we don't. But look at all the advertising and marketing that's put into inducements. And I'm talking, there's a field called neuromarketing, meaning having to think about brain function and how to best induce people to buy things like this. It's, yes, we have free will, but we also have people working against us, grabbing our limbic system and saying, go buy that. Now, I want to show you an item that's more specific to Indian country, meaning American Indian, Alaska Native, and First Nations, and lots of indigenous people, actually. And it's a stress model. So where does the stress come from? Next slide. This is a boarding school in Choctaw Nation. Tanampo at the top, that means a gun. And I use that because this is the place, these are the places across the country where so much of Native culture was killed. Not to mention sometimes individuals, but certainly Native culture. And so let's take a look at the lived experience of American Indians in the past and the present and what that holds for the future. Next slide. And so what you see up here is kind of a dementia, diabetes, syndemic just referring to interacting factors. All these multifactorial conditions are not operating in isolation, but they affect each other. And again, the embodiment of oppression. So next click. In the blue in the middle is the colonized etiology of indigenous dementia and diabetes. And we're going to fill that black void up with all kinds of inputs related to Indian country. The yellow one, the yellow bubble at the top, colonizers' disruption of a sense of coherence. That is a term from the medical sociologist Aaron Antonevsky, whose entire career was spent asking the question and answering what causes health, not what causes disease, what causes health. His career-long summary is that in populations where there is a sense of coherence about life, not perfect life or anything, but a sense of coherence, the organization of society and family and so forth typically works pretty well. That's where you have the highest health status. You disrupt a sense of coherence. Look at Ukraine today, for example, and you have lost that, and all kinds of pathology starts to develop. Next click. So what happened that disrupted the sense of coherence on this continent? Genocide, land, stealing land, forced removal, marching across the country to put these undesirable people in the way, that is the indigenous people, somewhere else. They called them reservations, but at that time, we think of them actually as concentration camps. Now today, reservation might feel like home, but in the beginning, it was a concentration camp. But I've never seen that phrase used in typical American history literature. And then somebody controls your food, they control you, they own you. And that's what happened. Next. So you have, in this loss of sense of coherence, you have cultural systems damage. And in all places where you have humans, next, you have some kind of social organization that includes kinship rules, how to get food, beliefs about religion, politics, economics, and all those things. All human groups have those on some scale. But when they stop working because of interference by others, being put in a concentration camp, not being able to conduct your own food activity, food gathering, and so forth, it is extremely disruptive, of course. Next. Now over to the right then, you live a life with a sense of vulnerability. Very distressing, social, psychological, cultural distress. And here we're seeing the word stress in here. Next. Down at the bottom, the yellow bullet, we might answer the question some might have of, well, that's ancient history. I've heard people literally say to me, get over it. It's not over, as we all know, I think, in this particular group together today. And so there are today's attacks on sovereignty, the business. I'll give you one real case example from here, Choctaw Nation. In 2007, got a letter, all Choctaw members, Oklahoma Choctaw people got a letter from the tribal chief at that time because the Oklahoma legislature was wanting to make the tribes give them part of their gaming profits. Just give it to the state. And he said, surprisingly, yes, I want you to vote yes for that. But the back channel reason for that was that the legislators were threatening to make gaming really difficult for the tribes. So you either give us some of your profit or we're going to almost shut you down. Not a lawyer here, but I think that's pretty close to extortion. And that happened. That was passed. That happens today. The last time I looked at this was, I think, around 2019 or so. And it's over $100 million that are just taken from the tribes and put in the state treasury to do who knows what with. Certainly not to pay teachers here. Next. So what happens when people live a life of toxic stress and vulnerability? You engage in stress buffering, often unhealthy behavior. James Jackson, the gerontologist from Michigan, University of Michigan, said, yes, we know, we have health education. People know things that you shouldn't do. They're not healthy, and yet it still happens. And he says, not because people are stupid, but because people are trying to cope with stresses in their lives. And these are some of the ways in which people self-treat. Next. SES, socioeconomic status. We know that poverty kills. We also know how to fix that. Is that something that's commonly known? Joseph Stiglitz, the American Nobel Prize-winning economist, Anthony Atkinson in England, Thomas Piketty in France, all have the formula to eradicate poverty. But guess what? We're not willing to do that. The redistribution of wealth is something that is not going to happen because somebody wishes for it to happen. Right now, when you have economic disparities like we see today, we see the corresponding health disparities as well. And so socioeconomic status, money and power go together. And when we look at population segments across the country, guess where the least amount of that is? Next. Up in the top right-hand side, healing system conflicts. Biomedicine is very powerful, of course, and yet a lot of Native people have a balanced idea about what causes health and or disease. And so sometimes these don't actually fit together so well. Next. Genetic admixture, next. And so what we see here, the top two FABs and the PPPs are related to metabolism and effective metabolism. But we see the E4 allele there. And we think that is a unique property, as we were saying earlier, and we don't understand fully why, even though when it's present, it is not as harmful potentially as it is in a white person. Hopefully someday that'll get figured out. Next. Allostatic load means the degree of stress a person lives with. And so with age, as people get older, as we saw in the bar graph, up to 2050, American Indians are going to be getting older and older, the stress level goes up because our ability to manage homeostasis, I think not just physically, but also emotionally, gets a little harder to deal with, not gone, just a little more difficult to deal with. And then the next bullet, the next bubble is the last one. And so what people have told me when I interview elders, they talk about these conditions, these cardiometabolic conditions here as the white man's diseases. That's what this, we're kind of visited with these matters because of the intrusion, we'll call it. So collectively now, we've got all of these words in here, but the important part of this chart actually are the red arrows. It's the red arrows that represent the process by which these all interact with each other, compound each other, and are going to convert from racist beliefs into laws and policy that are harmful, particularly to non-majority population. Okay, next, we're going to switch now to kind of what do we do about this? Well, one of the ways that we deal with this is to make health education more relevant, more connect better with Native culture. So here's an example of this that's specifically about dementia, but notice the short phrase, heart and brain, healthy heart, healthy brain. We're talking about cardiometabolic conditions, actually. And the next one, it's a similar look, but a different person. Do the next slide, please. Yeah. Same text by and large, and these are all available through CDC, and as you see, they're ASTO and also IA Square. I have those references at the last slide. Next. So dealing with culture and the dementias, go ahead and populate this, please, Dr. Minocha. Okay. This person, this woman, and this is a pseudonym, of course, has some significant cognitive impairment compounded by diabetes. And you can see that vascular dementia, Lewy body dementia. Next. But here's what I wanted to point out. One more click. Her granddaughter said to me, Pokney, which is the Choctaw word for grandmother, she sees things that we don't. Now, that's different than saying she sees things that aren't there. That would be sort of the um, biomedical and other kinds of philosophical rationalities that would define it as hallucinations. That's not how this family saw this. They saw her talking as if she was talking to someone they couldn't see. They were on the other side. She was talking to people that had died before, naming them, talking about favorite horses and dogs and gardens. And she, pre-death, was looking in to the other side. And that was much less disturbing to them than somebody saying she's got hallucinations. Next. Now, this slide you saw from Dr. Lewis, and this is Dr. Jacqueline and her team. This is a stone pathway. And my understanding of this, and I hope I get this right, is that they first presented some of the native people with this imagery that started out with the path being wide at the left side of the chart and narrowing, as the dementia progressed and the person became less able. I said, nope, opposite, other way around. They are experiencing their late life in ways that we can't imagine. It's expansive rather than collapsing. Next. This is another slide that Dr. Lewis had. It shows that image plus going to that website, the iCare website, or go to the Memory Keepers Medical Discovery Team website, and you can get to all of those. Next slide. This is the one and only book that I know of that is specifically about dementia and indigenous people, from British Columbia Press, University of British Columbia Press. I've got a couple of things in there. Dr. Jacqueline does, Dr. Lewis does, and it's not that we make any money for it. I'm not advertising it. We don't get anything there, but we're glad to have this out there. And next, these are some resources. International Association for Indigenous Aging has a huge amount. Recruitment Partners refers to the fact that Native people are underrepresented in research on Alzheimer's disease and other dementias. And then at CDC, they have the Healthy Brain Initiative, which produced a specialty book called Roadmap for Indian Country, the roadmap meaning how to implement programs for Native elders in their tribes. Next. And this is the end. And Yokoki is thank you. Chapisala Chikis mean you, I will later see. So that's what I had to share with you. And so thank you all very much.